Welcome to this explainer. When you hear Rolex, you're probably picturing modern luxury, glitz, and, well, absolute prestige. But we're going to bypass all of that today. We're uncovering the gritty, completely unbelievable true story behind the rise of the world's most famous watch brand. It's a wild ride, and definitely not the story you're expecting. Let's set the scene. 1893, Germany. Because the origins of this massive empire actually kick off with a profound tragedy. At just 12 years old, young Hans Wilsdorf loses both of his parents. He's orphaned. The family business is immediately sold off by his relatives, and Hans, he's shipped away to a boarding school. Imagine being that young and just having your entire foundation ripped out from under you.
And unfortunately, life had another brutal hit waiting for him. While traveling to London in 1903 to try and build a life for himself, his entire remaining inheritance, which was about 3,300 German gold marks, is completely stolen. He's left with literally nothing in his pockets. But he did have one thing no thief could touch, a relentless passion for watches. So how does a penniless orphan go on to build the biggest luxury watch empire in history? Let's find out.
Section 1. The Orphan Who Built Rolex.
Desperate to just survive, Hans took a sales job at a London watchmaking company. Now, most people would treat this as just a way to pay the rent, right? But Hans used it to get a front-row seat to the industry's biggest flaw. He noticed the market was totally disconnected from the consumer. While every other brand was obsessing over making these incredibly fancy, decorative pocket watches, Hans realized something crucial. Everyday people, the folks riding buses and trains, they just wanted a simple, accurate, and durable watch, something that wouldn't break or constantly lose time.
Section 2. Rebranding the wristwatch.
By 1905, a 24-year-old Hans decides it's time to make a move. He partners with his brother-in-law to form the Wilsdorf and Davis firm, betting their entire future on what seemed like a totally crazy prediction at the time, that wristwatches would eventually completely replace pocket watches. But here's the massive twist question Hans had to solve. How do you sell a wristwatch when society thinks they're only for women? Men back then relied strictly on pocket watches. Wristwatches were seen purely as feminine jewelry. So how do you completely flip an entire society's mindset?
Well, to hack consumer behavior, Hans did something incredibly clever. Instead of fighting the perception, he just leaned right into it. He launched models with precious metal straps, swapping out the usual leather for gold and silver, and marketed them specifically as bracelet watches. It was a subtle shift, but absolutely genius. They became an instant hit across Britain.
But he knew that to build a true global empire, Wilsdorf and Davis just wasn't going to cut it. He needed a brand name that was universal, easy to pronounce in any language, and looked aesthetically clean on a tiny watch dial. So he literally combined different alphabets, ran through hundreds of options, and in 1908 finally trademarked his short, snappy name, Rolex.
Clever marketing wasn't enough, though. The product actually had to work flawlessly. And remember, wristwatches are tiny, which made perfect accuracy incredibly tough to pull off back then. But Hans relentlessly studied horology, worked with experts, and developed a groundbreaking movement, the 15-line caliber 200. By 1910, it became the very first wristwatch movement in the world to receive a Swiss chronometer certificate for extreme accuracy. He proved Rolex wasn't just a pretty face, it was a serious timekeeping machine.
Section 3. Surviving the Great War.
So business is absolutely booming. Hans has a 60-person team, they're expanding across Europe, and then World War I hits. To fund the war effort, the British government suddenly slaps a massive 33% export duty on watches. Literally overnight, Rolex's prices skyrocket compared to local competitors, and sales absolutely tank. It was a crisis that forced Hans to pack up the entire operation and relocate to Switzerland just to keep the company alive.
But, Hans had a knack for finding opportunity in disaster. He noticed soldiers in the trenches couldn't fumble around with heavy codes to check a pocket watch. Timing in war was literally life or death, so he launched the trench watch. It featured unbreakable glass, a super durable body, and luminescent radium hands so soldiers could read the time in pitch darkness. And when those soldiers returned home as heroes, still wearing those wristwatches, well, men everywhere finally ditched the pocket watch. The wristwatch had officially gone mainstream.
Section 4. The Oyster and the Channel.
Now that everyone was wearing wristwatches, Hans aimed at their next biggest vulnerability, dust and water. They were constantly getting inside the cases and destroying the delicate mechanics.
So he completely scrapped the old leaky snap-on design, which basically closed like a cheap lunchbox. Instead, he engineered a sealed screw-on body with rubber rings and a tight winding crown that locked down like a submarine hatch. In 1926, this breakthrough gave us the Rolex Oyster, the world's very first waterproof watch. Of course, he knew nobody would just take his word for it. To prove this wasn't some cheap gimmick, Hans hired British swimmer Mercedes-Benz as his first brand ambassador. Her mission? Swim the English Channel with the watch attached to her necklace. Now, the freezing water forced her to stop after a grueling 10 hours, but when they checked the Rolex Oyster, it had survived perfectly. Hans went all out advertising this triumph, even putting the watch on display inside actual retail fish tanks with live fish swimming around it.
Section 5. The perpetual movement.
Okay, so you have a waterproof case, but there's still a major flaw in the user experience. These mechanical watches had to be manually wound every couple of days. And if you forgot to screw the crown back on tight after winding it, boom, water rushes in and destroys the watch. Hans brilliantly solved this by inventing the perpetual rotor. He used the natural, everyday movement of the wearer's hand. That motion causes a semicircular rotor to spin 360 degrees inside the case. And those gears transfer the kinetic energy to automatically tighten the mainspring. You basically wound the watch just by living your life. And just like that, the legendary Rolex Oyster Perpetual was born.
Section 6. Conquering the extremes.
The 1940s brought unimaginable tragedy back to Hans. World War II totally wrecked global supply chains, tanking sales once again. But far worse, Hans lost his beloved wife in 1944. These were undoubtedly his darkest years. Yet relying on that resilient fighter mindset he built as a destitute orphan, he poured his profound grief straight back into innovation. For instance, in 1945 he launched the Datejust, the first automatic watch to show the date. When customers said the date window was too small to read, legend has it a drop of water fell perfectly over the date on Hans's own watch, magnifying the numbers. That simple accident inspired him to permanently add a 2.5x magnifying glass, the famous Cyclops lens, right onto the crystal. Problem solved.
Rolex spent the next 15 years achieving absolute, undeniable supremacy. And they did it by building highly specialized tool watches. In '53, they launched the Explorer for extreme mountaineers scaling Everest. In '55, the GMT Master gave pilots a rotating bezel for crossing time zones. And by 1960, the Deep Sea Special, an experimental beast that survived the crushing pressure 11,000 meters down in the ocean. They quite literally conquered the highest peaks and the deepest depths.
Hans Wilsdorf passed away in 1960 at the age of 79. Which brings us to our final thought. When the creator passes away, but his machine ticks perpetually, does his legacy ever really die? As we've seen in this explainer, that destitute orphan from Germany didn't just build a luxury brand. He engineered a legacy so durable, so precise, that it effectively made him immortal. Thanks for hanging out with me to uncover this incredible story.